evening. My name is Jason Perot, Chairman of the Northborough Board of Selectmen. This open meeting of the joint committees, Board of Selectmen, Northborough Appropriations Committee, Northborough Financial Planning Committee, and Northborough School Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of June 16, 2021, an act relative to extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency. All members of these boards and committees are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order allows these boards and committees to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda. The agenda for this meeting shows you the YouTube live stream to view the meeting. You can also go to the Northborough Town website, look for the remote meetings button, and that will take you to the link. I believe we're also accessible through Verizon Channel 30 and Charter Channel 192 on Northborough Cable Access Television Government channels. Members of the public who, ensuring public access does not ensure public participation. Unless such participation is required by law, this meeting will not feature public comment. I'd next like to go through and confirm the remote access of all the participants in this meeting, which will be a lengthy exercise, so please bear with me. I'll begin with the boards and committees. My name is Jason Perot, Chairman of the Board of Selectmen. Vice Chair Leslie Rutan.
Present.
Clerk Scott Rogers.
Present.
Member Julianne Hirsch.
Present.
And member Kristen Wickstead.
Present.
I'd next like to go to the Appropriations Committee. Anthony Petit.
Present.
Janice Height.
Present.
George Brinkle.
Present.
Tim Kalin.
Present.
Bob D'Amico.
Present.
And Richard Niebuhr.
Present.
Thank you. Next, Northborough Financial Planning Committee. David DeVries.
Present.
John Rappa.
Present.
Tom Spataro.
Present.
Michael Hodge. I believe Michael's absent this evening. And Bill Peterson.
Present.
Thank you. And now Northborough School Committee. Lauren Bailey Jones.
Present.
Kelly Gwinnett.
Present.
Aaron Tagliaferri. I think is not present yet. Joan Frank. I don't think I see Joan connected. And Keith LaBelle. And I don't think we have Keith. Okay, next I'd like to go through the municipal and school staff members who will be participating in this meeting. Town Administrator John Coderre.
Present.
Assistant Town Administrator Becca Meekins.
Present.
Finance Director Jason Little.
Present.
And Treasurer Collector Lisa Trost.
Present.
And I think I have all of those members. And next up, Northborough School Administration, Superintendent Greg Martineau.
Present.
Director of Finance, Rebecca Pellegrino.
Present.
And I'm looking around on my Brady Bunch grid here to see if there's anyone else that I've missed. Is there anyone I'm missing from school administration?
No.
That's it? I'm sorry, Greg, did we have everybody?
No, you have everyone. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. This meeting is also being, produced through Northborough Cable Access, who is connected. For purposes of this meeting this evening, this is going to be the presentation of the financial trend monitoring system and forward projections to kind of set the context for our fiscal year 2023 budget process, which we'll be conducting over the next several months leading up to town meeting in April. Because this is essentially an informational presentation and there is no deliberation being conducted by any of the participating boards and committees, I would ask your indulgence to essentially allow this to be deemed a Board of Selectmen meeting. And we will forego the need to have everybody convene and adjourn and run their questions through their respective chairs, if that's okay with everybody. Very good, thank you. And so having said that, I think we're ready to begin, and I will hand the presentation over to Town Administrator John Coderre. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you all for being here in your busy schedules. I know this is another night commitment. In my opinion, as I state every year, this is probably the second most important meeting that we have as a collective body next to town meeting. This is the point in the fiscal year where we're really getting together to look backwards 10 years at our trends, forecast forward 5 years, and to then talk about the assumptions about what do we see happening in our fiscal reality for the town of Northborough, and talk a little bit about what do we see coming up in the upcoming fiscal 2023 budget. So if you just bear with me one moment, I'm going to share my screen. So I can't see everybody at this point. So if you have any questions, if you would please raise your hand, and the chairman will acknowledge you and interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. There's sort of 3 segments to the presentation. The first is just a little bit of a recap of where we've been and how fiscal 2022 is shaking up. Actually, why don't I use my agenda slide? So we're going to do a little bit of a look back and see how things are shaping up for fiscal 2022, if we're on track. That's sort of one piece. The second is to look at the fiscal indicators to see if there's any significant changes, anything that we should be concerned with or discussing in more detail. Then we'll talk about forecasting forward 5 years. What do those projections look like, including some preliminary numbers for fiscal 2023. As always, we try to do the best we can to analyze potential tax impacts. I will tell you that right now, the numbers are pretty preliminary, and but we do want to have an honest attempt at looking at what the tax impacts are forecast to be moving forward based on the assumptions that we're going to review here today. In my opinion, as I say at the beginning, the most important piece of this meeting is the fact that we're getting all of the critical boards and committees, the policymaking boards and committees together to hear the same information, understand the assumptions, and to have a chance to talk about opportunities, areas of concern, and get on the same page essentially around building some consensus about what we see coming in the upcoming fiscal year. In terms of recap, just fiscal 21, as you well know, was delayed. Our closeout was delayed. The state budget was delayed by 6 months. And ultimately, when we did finally set the tax rate for fiscal 21, based on the revenue that we received from the state, which was we budgeted a reduction, they came in level funded. We were actually able to reduce the average single family home tax bill by about $65. As that year played out, and the reason why I'm starting with fiscal 2021 is because we just closed out fiscal 21, and that was ended on June 30th of 2021. We don't have our certified free cash just yet, but we do have a pretty good estimate that it's about $3.4 million, which is pretty healthy. And there's a number of things that have contributed to that. And that's important because that rolls forward, and that is a funding source, particularly for our capital budget in the upcoming fiscal 23 budget. In terms of revenues, much like the state, I'm sure you've heard Governor Baker say when they closed out fiscal 21, they had some healthy surpluses as well. And the reason is those budgets were set in the middle of the pandemic. As the vaccines rolled out, the economy opened back up and recovered. A lot of the economic-driven revenues, the elastic revenues, things like motor vehicle excise, building permits, hotel meals, those types of things really bounced back. So for us, we finished fiscal 21 about 2.8% above what we had budgeted for revenues. Now, on a typical year, we expect to be around 2%. So we want to typically be around 2% on our revenues and around 2% on our appropriations. In terms of appropriations, we did see also a healthy number here, about 2.4%. The big bulk of that number, the returns came from under general government. If you remember, we set aside some extra funding, $375,000 in the Appropriation Committee's reserve account. Thankfully, between a mild winter and the federal government coming forward with assistance to deal with the pandemic, we did not have to use those funds. So they just closed out back into free cash. We also had very good experience with our employee benefits and our insurance lines. We had some staff turnover with public safety, police and fire, where we brought in some new employees at lower wages. So those are really the sources of the appropriation side. But combined, we have $3.4 million in free cash from fiscal 21. I always like to put things graphically when I can, and I always like to put them in some historic context. This is a 30+ year trend of free cash. Free cash bounces all around. It's largely dependent on what's happening with the economy. And you can see the last couple of years, what it's done. We only had about $2 million in free cash when we closed out fiscal 20. That's when we were hit by the pandemic. As things improved, we still had conservative budget estimates for 21, but the economy improved. And so we're seeing that 3.4 million in free cash. This is a very positive thing for us because it means that we have additional resources, particularly to expend on capital as we come into fiscal 2023. But it also means that the economy is returning and the revenues are improving. We'll always lag, okay, because we're making our revenue estimates 12 to 18 months before they materialize. And in a pandemic where we don't know what's going to happen, we didn't know if the vaccine was going to be successful or not, or whether or not the governor was going to shut down the economy. So those numbers were, of course, conservative. But we did finish the year out with a good, healthy surplus. Now, a little bit of an update on how FY22, the current fiscal year that we're in, we're roughly halfway through it. Just by a way of review, town meeting was on time this year. Our closeout of fiscal 21 and the audit has been delayed. Normally, we have our auditor in November. The audit's complete. Our auditor decided, like many people during the pandemic, to retire. So we actually had to go out and do a process to get new auditors. So that took a little bit of time. But the big issue is there's a lot of federal aid and grant compliance that's going on right now. We have Fema Reimbursement, the CARES Act. All of that is causing an extra workload. And so basically closing out fiscal 21 is a little bit delayed, and that's why we haven't gotten our official certification on our free cash yet. But we're pretty confident those numbers are good. In terms of the state budget for fiscal 2022, revenues have been going really well for them, and our state budget numbers were pretty much dead on that we had budgeted. About $12,000 above after you net out assessments. So just to remind everybody, when it comes to state aid, the state gives us aid, and then they charge us for things like the MBTA and mosquito control and charter schools. So we always look at the net impact of what we are getting in additional aid and how much the assessments are going up. So for fiscal 22, it's about as close as you can get on a $5.5 million account, about 13,000. So state aid is locked in very well for us for fiscal 22. In November of 2021, the Board of Selectmen held the tax classification hearing. That's when the final fiscal 22 budget is actually set. We submit all the information to the state and they certify our tax rate. And the estimated increase for a single family home tax bill was $295. I think we forecast or estimated at the beginning that it would be about 298. So very, very much on target for that. The last piece that is unfolding in real time during fiscal 22 that has an impact on 22 potentially, as well as impacts on fiscal 23, are the various state and federal assistance programs that are rolling out. I'm sure you've read about a number of these. Just by way of recapping these so you kind of understand what's in play at the moment. The first one is that we do get FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, is emergency COVID reimbursements. That was set to expire at the end of this calendar year. And the federal government extended it through April in acknowledgement of the fact that we have boosters and vaccine clinics and variants and ongoing costs and expense with our direct response. So FEMA reimbursement has been extended. That's a positive thing for us because that was set to expire. FEMA is very difficult to get reimbursements for. They love to reject your request for reimbursement, and they tend to take a long time in processing those and us actually seeing our money. Sometimes we'll get federal reimbursements for a snowstorm, and it'll take a year after the fiscal year to get those reimbursements. The positive news, though, that's been extended. The other thing I'm sure you've read about is the $1.2 trillion Federal Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. This was passed and signed into law November 15th by the president. And that has investments in water infrastructure, broadband, internet, roads, bridges, public transportation, and then other things like clean energy and climate resiliency investment. That is going to be a little while before it rolls out because those funds are going to roll through the state government. And so it's going to be a while. It's subject to appropriation at the at the state level. So it's going to be a while for these. If there's anything in there we can take advantage of, it's going to be a while before it flows down to us. But at least that's been improved and that's in play. You've probably heard about the $1.85 trillion Build Back Better Act that is pending. If you read the newspaper today, a senator from West Virginia has withdrawn his support of that. So as of right now, that is on hold. Now if you think about the Infrastructure Investment Act, that's about the infrastructure, roads, buildings, physical, tangible things. The Build Back Better Act focuses more on people, investments in childcare, child tax credits, some environmental justice issues, affordable health care, and investments in affordable housing. So how that might potentially down the line impact us remains to be seen. The one you've probably heard quite a bit about, it's been in the newspaper a lot, is the $4.5 million in American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA funding. Those are funds that came from the federal government directly to the town of Northborough. We have physically received half of that funding right now, and that is available to us and will be part of the planning process for fiscal 2023, especially in terms of things like capital investments, things that we postponed and cut during the pandemic. But essentially, ARPA funds are, the categories that they can be used in are very limited, but it's to respond to the public health emergency or its negative economic consequences, revenue replacement, or investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The revenue replacement is the one that we focused on locally because, and we believe that we can take all of this money in under the revenue replacement model, which essentially is revenues that we lost during the pandemic. By bringing it in that way, we're not limited to just water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. We could use these funds to fund almost anything that we would normally be looking at through the budget process. So that will be unfolding. More to come on that in January. The other thing you might have read about is the $4 billion state COVID recovery bill. Putting aside the earmarks that were in that bill, it has significant information regarding housing, behavioral services, workforce, infrastructure investment, funding for local boards of health. We don't know what that is just yet or what form that would take. There are small business grants. There are also infrastructure investment grants for water, sewer, culverts, dams. These are things that are important to us. And then there's education funding potentially for HVAC upgrades and improvements. So we're still waiting for the details of that and how that funding will flow through the existing state programs. We also have state revenues, which I just mentioned in I mentioned our revenues in 2022, but the state revenue outlook, the current fiscal year for 2022 is tracking above benchmark. And the fiscal 2023 revenue outlook as of right now looks strong. That's going to import and play into our state aid numbers, our Chapter 70 numbers, and that is still unknown at this point in time. The last piece is the state ARPA funding. So in addition to the town receiving ARPA funding directly, the state has ARPA money as well. And a significant portion of that is going to be geared towards infrastructure. We've had some preliminary discussions with our legislative delegation about how that funding could be used and whether or not there is potential for some earmarks for the town in that. So that will be unfolding and remains to be seen. So when you take all of this stuff into play, this is sort of the federal and state context within which we are working on our fiscal 23 budget. And a couple of things I just want to touch upon. In terms of our budget priorities, it's important to remember that we have a process. So there is a budget process that takes into consideration, federal, state grants and funding. We have financial policies that apply, and probably the one that is most relevant is the amount of one-time revenues that we bring into operating budgets. We want to be very cautious about creating structural deficits in our operating budgets. We, of course, tonight are going to talk about the trend monitoring, looking back, our forecast forward. The two big plans, I think, that these various components will have an impact on are our 6-year capital improvement plan, which is updated every year, and that includes the projects for the schools, and our master plan that we just recently completed. The master plan implementation committee has just really started meeting. They've had 3 or 4 meetings, and they have identified their 2 top priorities, which are a downtown master plan and a sidewalk master plan, and generally walkability. Those are 2 things that were identified in the plan. They've been voted by the implementation committee as 2 priorities. And so those would be two areas that we would be looking at as we start looking at resources that are available to us. Obviously, service level staffing has to be something that's recurring for us. We still have, and again, the ARPA money is meant to also be our response to COVID. So as I said at the beginning, the FEMA emergency funds are going to expire in April. We don't know that the pandemic will be over. We don't know if we're still going to be running clinics and boosters. We don't know what the impact is going to be on our departments. So we need to make sure that we have funding available to take care of that. In the context of all this, the big thing is that we have to make sure that whatever one-time revenues through grants that we can get or through federal programs or state programs, we have to make sure that they're sustainable. And that's really the key to the exercise tonight, is making sure that when we go through this process and we put our FY23 budget together, that it is sustainable beyond the current upcoming fiscal year. So that's sort of where we are. Most of the information regarding these things is unfolding in real time. All the departments are looking at the details. You can read the acts and still not know whether or not we would be potentially able to take advantage of these, because the details of it are still being flushed out. But these are all things that we're watching and all things that will come into play. Obviously, we don't want to use our ARPA funds to pay for a capital project that the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act or the state ARPA funding might be able to finance for us. So we want to leverage the money that we have against potential for other grants and resources at the federal and the state level. This is going to take a little bit of time to unfold. So we're watching all of that. I just want to take a moment and to remind everybody how we got through the pandemic. And so in terms of fiscal difficulty, and I always use the analogy of people's private lives, your personal life. If during the pandemic you were unfortunate to get sick or lose your job or suffer some negative economic impacts, the first thing that you do is you try to cut back on your spending, right? You then would maybe have to dip into your savings account. You would probably not put anything into your savings account. You might postpone buying a new car or doing projects around your house if you can do that safely. And you would probably stop contributing to your retirement account, right? And then when things get better and you get back on your feet, you are able to bring your level of spending back up. You stop drawing from your savings account and hopefully replenish what you used. You start doing the capital projects around your house again, taking care of your house and your vehicle. And you hopefully are in a position to start contributing back to your retirement account. That's on a micro level. If you scale that up to a macro level for the town, that is exactly what we did. And that approach allowed us to largely leave service impacts to a minimum. So we did have to cut our operating budgets. We reduced budgets 1% in 21, and we constrained them in 2022. We used some free cash, additional one-time revenues in the operating budget, $378,000. We stopped contributing to our savings account. Normally, we put $200,000 a year in stabilization. We did not do that in 21 or 22. The big one is we postponed over $800,000 in planned capital projects in FY21. And then because we didn't end the year fiscal 20 with a lot of surplus because of the pandemic, we didn't have a lot of money to do pay-as-you-go in fiscal 2022. Now, what's the result? The result of that is we have a bubble of capital projects. You know, we like to smooth them out and plan them over 6 years. Well, we now have a bubble that needs to be addressed. And so the good news is some of these federal aid that is one-time monies is a perfect use to deal with the backlog in capital and those one-time expenses. The other big one that we did is we stopped contributing to our other post-employment benefit trust fund. This is an unfunded liability that we have to address. And we typically put about $500,000 or $550,000 away each year. We did not do that in fiscal 21, and we did not do that in fiscal 22. We have to get back to that. Our financial condition, when we are rated by the bond rating agencies, when we go out to borrow for large projects, they want to see that you're making capital investments. They want to see that you have appropriate level of reserves, and they very much want to see that you are contributing to your unfunded liabilities like pension and OPEB. So, in just stepping back, everything went according to plan. This is all positive news. When you think about the pandemic, the town of Northborough came through it, in my opinion, with flying colors. We weren't slashing and cutting services. The schools were able to continue doing what they do. Public safety had the resources they needed. We had an appropriate, if not stellar, response to the pandemic. We still continue to be a leader statewide in terms of vaccination rates and clinics and outreach and information. So our planning, both our policies as well as our execution of those during this pandemic went off perfectly. Now, that means, let me just say this, the whole point of making these maneuvers and why we put ourselves in this position was so that we could deal with a budget surprise, a pandemic, a storm, a recession, and buy ourselves a fiscal year to come up with more long-term strategies or to wait for federal and state assistance. In this case, being able to make these cuts, maintain our services, allowed us to wait for the federal government to go through with the CARES Act and the Arpa funding. So now we are in a position to look back and do the things that I just said, replenish our savings account, get caught up on the capital, make sure we're putting money aside for OPEB. So those items should be and need to be the priority moving forward in fiscal 2023. So I'm going to shift gears now, and I'm going to talk now about the fiscal indicators. I'm going to start by saying I don't plan to go through, I know you're all disappointed, I don't plan to go through all of the indicators. What I've done traditionally in the last couple of years is touch on the ones that are in motion that I think we need to discuss. The ones that are favorable will indicate are favorable, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. We don't need to. If somebody has a question about any of those, I'm happy to talk about them. So for those of you that might be new or viewers who are watching this at home, what is financial condition? Loosely, it's our ability to maintain our services, to withstand interruptions like pandemics and recessions, and to meet the demands of natural growth and decline and change. So the key for us is financial trend monitoring is the way in which we are able to objectively measure and report our financial condition. So when the Board of Selectmen or the chair of the Appropriations Committee says Northborough is in good financial condition, we're not just saying that, we can point to the indicators, quantitatively prove that. I'm going to go through some slides quickly now. I've talked about these in the past, so we want to make sure that we're solvent on a budgetary basis. But one of the big things about indicators is that we want to make sure that we're interjecting long-run solvency questions like OPEB and debt and pensions. Those must be taken into consideration on an annual basis because they are going to stack up on you either positively or negatively over the years. I told you I'm going to move through these. I'm going to stop on this slide. Fiscal distress versus fiscal crisis. You've heard me speak to these before. Fiscal distress is a temporary imbalance. The pandemic caused fiscal distress to the organization, the town of Northborough. The difference is if we didn't take appropriate moves and maneuvers, we could find ourselves in fiscal crisis where we are unable to pay our bills and we start sliding into receivership essentially. So for us, that's why our policies are so important and to take action, a disciplined, planned out action to deal with the distress to keep us from going into a fiscal crisis. So we, as I said, there was no question. If you remember when we had this meeting last year, boom, went right down the line. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to get through this immediate impact while we allow time to think about other options and to give time for the federal and state government to provide the appropriate aid that they should do. Always the goal for us is to stay out of a knee-jerk reaction and to have a chance to intelligently, with good data information, come up with a response to some unpleasant financial information. So I'm going to shift now, talk a little bit about the indicators. So as of right now, we have 14 indicators that we track, and we do this every year. There are revenue indicators, there's expenditure indicators, there are pension indicators, unfunded liability indicator, debt indicator, financial reserve indicator, and capital investment. So if you think about all the things that we always talk about, your revenues, your expenditures, your financial reserves, how much you're taking on for debt, are you making appropriate investments in your capital? That's what these measures are here for. And as you can see, the first three are favorable. I want to just mention property tax and uncollected property taxes. Our revenues throughout the pandemic really didn't waver. Our tax collection rate stayed at 98, 99%. People had the ability and the willingness to pay their taxes. Our revenue and expenditures per capita always stayed in line. So we never found ourselves in a position where we had expenditures exceeding available revenues, largely due to the fact that we had federal and state aid. So those indicators are positive. The ones I'm going to spend some little bit of time talking about tonight are state aid, economic growth revenues, because those are the ones that have been impacted by the pandemic. And then we have to come back and have a little chat about other post-employment liability, because it has been unfavorable and now we have stepped away from it for 2 years. So we need to get back to that. Looking at the balance of these, one-time revenues in the operating budget, we We brought some in fiscal 21, and then we weaned ourselves off of that for 2022. So that's favorable. Personnel and employee benefits, they've been stable. I mentioned the only other one here that's showing up as unfavorable is pension liability. As I've said before, pension liability is on a funding plan for 2036. We are participants in the Worcester Regional Retirement System. There is nothing that any member of any board or committee on this call needs to do with regard to pension liability. It's unfavorable, but it's on a funding plan. It's set to be fully funded by 2036. So we don't need to spend time on that one. Debt service, we are at an all-time low in our debt service. It's about 4%. The great thing about that is we have positioned ourselves well for the upcoming fire station building project. So our debt is paid off and we're ready to bring on another large project. And our financial reserves, which is our stabilization fund and our free cash, has remained solid. We never had to during the pandemic. We used a little bit of our financial reserves, a little bit, 378,000 in free cash. We never dipped into our stabilization fund, and we did not get into a position where we were drawing down our reserves without a plan to get off of them. We used them as a stopgap measure, and then we were able to move away from that. In terms of the capital, both these capital are still pending the audit, and we're waiting to get our update on our pavement management plan. We're hoping that some of these infrastructure bills and ARPA funds from the state will help us with our pavement management, our culverts, and our sidewalks, because those are the three things that we have a significant need for. So I'm going to skip, unless anybody has any questions about the favorable indicators, I'm going to move forward to talk about state aid.
John, I just want to break in for a second.
Yes.
I'm not seeing the hand raise function from my end, so I don't know if people have that available to use if they wanted to indicate that they had a question. Perhaps, Greg, do you see that you? Oh,
It's there, Mr. Chair. All they need to do is hover over reactions
excellent.
and click it, and then you'll see raise hand above there.
Okay, I saw a couple people pop them up, so glad to see that it's there. If people do have questions at any point, please raise your hand and we will kind of maybe wait for an appropriate breaking point, but then invite those questions to come in.
Yeah, so there, again, it's difficult to do this on Zoom. I really miss sitting in a room with everybody. I think it's a little bit easier interaction. I can see reactions and read the room a little bit. But I would stop here and just say, I'm going to go to these highlighted indicators because these are the ones I think that are impacting our fiscal 23 budget. The other ones are favorable or stable. So we do have, for purposes of the presentation, all those indicators and all that information is there. And by the way, at the conclusion of the meeting, we will send you the full presentation. But for the moment, I'd like to work through the presentation with you in real time so people aren't moving ahead and reading the bottom line outcomes here. But I'm going to move on to these three highlighted at this point, unless anybody raises their hand. But we'll give you all this so you can see all of these. So in terms of state aid, those of you that have been around, you've seen this slide before. This is almost a 30-year history of our state aid. The valleys with the black arrows, those are recessionary periods where our state aid was cut. This chart shows state aid in nominal dollars, so not adjusted for inflation. These were real cuts in our state aid. And if you look from the end of the last recession, and you look at the pandemic, what you see is that we have received increases in our state aid, albeit small increases in our state aid. But we did not, because the state held us harmless in fiscal 21. That was the year that we were really concerned. 2022, the year we're in right now, is solid. And we're hoping that fiscal 23 continues to reflect a recovering economy. So when you look at it in nominal dollars, we're not losing state aid. But when you look at the state aid in terms of the indicator, which is state aid as a percentage of our revenues, basically a percentage of our operating budget, it is clearly a negative trend. So state aid used to make up over 13% of our operating budget going back to 2002. And you can see it if you look at this, you go back to 2002. I mean, look at the peak over here. We didn't get back to that until fiscal 18. That's crazy. But what we've seen is a steady, essentially, decline in the buying power of the state aid that we get. And because of that, state aid is an unfavorable trend for us. And in all likelihood, if state aid is only going up 1 or 2%, which is what we've seen for the last 5 or 6 years, and our budgets are going up 3 or 4%, then it is going to continue to decline as a revenue source for us. So it's down to 8.4% in fiscal 2022. I anticipate, even though in nominal dollars we'll see a 1%, maybe a little bit more in fiscal 23, it's going to be a negative trend for us for the foreseeable future. I just, based on our social economics, and really the big thing, you've heard the superintendent talk about this, and you've heard me talk about this, the Student Opportunity Act that was passed by the legislature. The bulk of our state aid comes in the form of Chapter 70 education aid. And all the increases of Chapter 70 funding is going towards the poorer communities, as it arguably should from a policy standpoint. And that means that the town of Northborough is getting a little small increase, and the lion's share of any additional state revenues are going to the Springfields and the Bostons and the communities with a more difficult or higher level of disadvantaged students. In terms of the fiscal 23 budget, normally the state would have a revenue consensus hearing, and that's normally done at the beginning of December. That actually has been postponed till tomorrow. So I don't have that data for you tonight. Normally that's something that I have. The revenue consensus hearing is where the governor, the legislature, the House, the Senate, and they bring in the Department of Revenue, they bring in the mass taxpayers, they bring in all of the area economists, and they say, what do you see happening in the Massachusetts economy, and what do you forecast for state revenues? So that's going to happen tomorrow, guys. But the only thing I can tell you right now is that for fiscal 2022, their revenues are doing very well. They're outpacing the same period last year by 18%. Now, that's outpacing the reduced revenue from last year due to the pandemic. In terms of their forecasts, because obviously they had an increased forecast for fiscal 2022, right now, as of December 3rd, their tax collections have surpassed their benchmarks by about 7%. That bodes well for, we're not looking at reductions in state aid for fiscal 2023. I don't think we're looking at a 7% increase for state aid as a whole, never mind what Northborough would get. But based on Northborough's trends, we have seen state revenues go up 3 to 6%. Our state aid in Northborough goes up 1, 1.5, 2% is the most we've seen in the last 6 years. I don't see fiscal 2023 being any different. So for budget planning purposes for fiscal 23, we're assuming that state aid is going to go up 1%. We might see another 0.5% or more. On a $70+ million budget, you're talking about $30,000 or $40,000. It's not going to be a material difference. The big thing for us is to know that the base state aid appears to be solid unless something happens that we are anticipating. Now, I always use the caveat that state aid is not a mathematical process, it's a political process. So again, what happens to their revenues does not translate into a comparable increase in Northborough state aid. We are just not going to see much of an increase. Most of the revenues that are coming through the state, and even a lot of the federal aid that's flowing through the state, if you start looking into these various acts, including the COVID Relief Act that was passed, COVID relief bill that was passed, the $4 billion bill, it's really geared towards disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged segments of those of communities. We don't fall into that category. So it's just the circumstances that we are in. Ultimately, when we go to set the tax rate, if we do receive additional state aid, the only thing we can do with it is reduce the tax impact. Never heard anybody complain about that when we get around to that part of the budget setting process. So that's where we are for state aid, looking at about a 1% for fiscal 2022. Next, I want to talk about economic growth revenues. So economic growth revenues are the things that took a beating during the pandemic. These are the elastic revenues that expand and contract with the economy. So motor vehicle excise, new growth, building permits, those are the big ones. If you look at this, indicator, it looks like it's stable, right? It doesn't look like a negative trend. If you look at fiscal 2021 at 7.5%, that's a little bit, this is where it's important to look at the graph, but you have to have intimate knowledge of the data and have an informed background as to how you'd interpret this. This is an unfavorable, at the moment, an unfavorable and uncertain indicator for us, because we have seen our local receipts, they took a bit of a beating, as you can see in 2020 due to COVID. But in 2021, they're artificially high, showing here because we had the last really large building permit for some development that took place out on Bartlett Street. That was a couple $100,000. So building permits buoyed that number up. We also had some Medicaid reimbursements that came through that buoyed that number up. Neither of those things we see happening again in fiscal 2023. We also, as we look at our local receipts, I just want to remind people that in 2022, the fiscal year we're in right now, we increased them by about 8%. What's happening in 2023? Here's a few things I want you to think about. Our anticipated meals tax is actually, when we set the tax rate in 2022, we had to lower it a little bit. Not by much, but it's not coming back as fast as we would like to see it, but it's okay. We only have 2 hotels in Northborough, and one of them is offline, and because they had a fire. There's no anticipated point of return, date of return for that. So the hotels is questionable. Motor vehicle excise is really the other big one in local receipts. And the way that works is we don't really know what motor vehicle excise is going to look like until we get, it's a tax that's collected by the state on behalf of the town. We don't really know what that looks like. We get that first really big commitment in February. So in February of 2022, during fiscal 2022, that's when we get some sense of what's happening with motor vehicle. That is then what we would really use as a point to look at 2023. If you're watching the papers and you're following along, what do we all keep hearing about? Supply chain disruptions, computer chip shortages, few new cars, fewer used cars, people are holding on to them. All of that indicates that we probably aren't going to see much in the way of growth in motor vehicle excise. But given that we don't know what's going to happen, we are basically thinking that's going to be relatively flat, maybe a little bit of improvement. And then the last piece, the building permits that I just spoke to. Last year, we got that last really big building permit. Like a large project can come in and the building permit can be $200,000 or $300,000. You pull a building permit to replace the windows in your house or build a deck and you pay $25. It's not the number of building permits, it's the nature and the size of the fee that is being paid. And the large industrial and commercial developments are the ones that really drive those numbers up. We're not seeing anything coming around the corner. So as of right now, for fiscal 2023, our assumption is that local receipts are gonna be level funded for right now. Unless we see something that changes that, that's kind of where we're playing out in terms of the assumption for 2023. And again, it's not a huge player in the budget. Motor vehicle is the biggest. You always hear me say taxes are about 82% of our operating budget. State aid's about 8.4%, and motor vehicle is about 5%. So motor vehicle is the big one. Building permits can be a big one, But when it is, it's usually tied to a large project and it's a one-time that pops up every couple of years, if you're lucky. So let me see. I do want to stop for a moment and touch base on health insurance. As I said, our benefit levels, our benefit expenses have been relatively stable. This is the chart on the right shows a 12 or 13-year history of our health insurance budget increases. And on average, we've been almost dead on at about 3%. That's remarkable. If you're reading the papers, you're seeing many communities with 8, 9, 10%. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see all the things that we've done to make the numbers on the right materialize in the way that we have. And the last big thing that we did was we consolidated carriers, and we consolidated to Fallon. And that was done in fiscal 19. And we have received several years of very reasonable increases, which has been great for us. We were just notified that Fallon is exiting the commercial market. So they're dropping us and every other community that has Fallon, which means we had to stop and go and put a rather complicated bid out on the streets, working with our health insurance consultants. We've spent probably the last month and a half to 2 months on this health insurance bid. And let me show you why this is so absolutely top priority and critical for us. If we see a 10% increase in health insurance, it's about a $612,000 increase in the operating budget. 3% increase for all the non-school budgets, for all the general government departments, police, fire, DPW, administration. A 3% increase is a little over $700,000. If health insurance goes up 10%, it will eat up 86% of all new revenues for the non-school departments. Clearly, we cannot meet our labor increases and our expense increases if that were to happen. So one of the things that we did has added to the complexity of the approach to health insurance for fiscal 23 is we are doing a joint procurement with the regional high school and the town of Southborough. So we've put things out in the bid. We've got the initial information back. We are waiting right now to see if Southborough is going to participate in this joint procurement. We believe that all three entities will be better off. And one of the reasons why we'd be better off is that we have, between all of us, we have over 500 subscribers. That is a legitimate amount of subscribers, which means we have bargaining power and our loss ratios actually mean something. If we're small, if you're not considered to be a valid, statistically valid entity because you don't have enough members, then they tend to push you into whatever the general market is doing. But if we're all going together, then we believe we're all going to be better off. So that's hanging in the balance at the moment. We're hoping by the end of the calendar year or pretty close to that, we'll know where we are with health insurance. That is the biggest piece of the budget at the moment that is outstanding and can have the largest sway on our fiscal 2023 health insurance. Clearly, if we get budget increases that are really bad, we're going to have to go back and 2/3 of that budget, although it's contained in the general government side of the budget, 2/3 of that are school employees. So we're going to have a conversation. We're hoping to avoid that through all of the work that we've done. Kelly, through the chair, I see a hand up. Kelly Gannett has a question.
Thanks. John, when is this expected to happen? Like, when is the Fallon done and when does the new insurance have to be established?
Fallon will finish out fiscal 2022. So they will be done in June of next year. So we're good for this fiscal year with Fallon, but they are not going to renew any commercial clients moving forward. They're moving to just dealing with Medicare. That's where the money is, apparently. And so they're dropping everybody. So working with the superintendent, we are anticipating in the next couple of weeks to have some information to share with regard to health insurance. Okay, nothing is more complicated in terms of negotiating, not just with the carriers, but we now have to convey the change in a carrier to all of our employees and all of the employee unions. That takes us a lot of information cost there. The good news is we believe that we're going to be able to maintain plan design as it exists right now in contribution rates at the moment and get a renewal that we can live with. Our goal is to get that renewal, below 4%, 5%, so that it is somewhat sustainable. Anybody have any questions on the health insurance? This has been consuming a tremendous amount of the financial team's effort over the last, as I said, month and a half. The last indicator I want to stop on is OPEB, because it's interesting. We've got some within the bad news, we've got some good news. If you look at the table, overall unfunded OPEB liability is significant for Northborough. It's significant for every entity, and everybody's trying to address it. And according to our auditor, we are actually one of the communities that is on the farthest end of making progress with regard to our OPEB. And we did that through increased hotel and meals taxes, the local option taxes, and we diverted $500,000 into an OPEB trust fund. And we did that beginning in fiscal 15. The problem is, as I already said, when the pandemic hit, we stopped contributing. So we did not contribute any money to the trust fund in FY20 or FY21. Now, the line I want to draw your attention to is the yellow highlighted line. That is our funding ratio. So you have an unfunded liability of $41 million at the moment. That's a big number. Our funding ratio is how much money we've set aside towards that unfunded liability. And at the moment, we're at 10%, 10.5%. Now, if you look at that line, we saw an increase in our funding ratio, despite the fact that we didn't put $1 million in when we were scheduled to. The real short answer there, guys, is the market, unlike the stabilization fund, the OPEB trust funds are invested in the state pension PRIT fund. And so they're able to invest in equities, in things that we can't invest in. So the stock market had a massive bull run. And so if you look at this, we have put about $3 million roughly into our trust fund, and we've earned almost $2 million in interest. That's incredible. That is not going to keep happening. That is not the way to get to full funding, because we all know there will be a market correction. The thing that we need to do in fiscal 2023, our top priority has got to be to get OPEB back on the OPEB funding plan. Just like your retirement, it's okay to put it on pause if you lose your job and you can't contribute. But when you get back on your feet, you need to not only make contributions, but if you can, make up for lost time. That's going to be something you're going to hear about multiple times when we talk about fiscal 2023. So, we roll forward. So again, just to recap, the 3 unfavorable state aid, not much we can do about that. It is a trend. It is what it is. In nominal dollars, we're not going to get beat up too bad. Economic growth revenues, we're watching them. They're slowly returning, but we think that we're not going to see those economic growth revenues are just going to, by the fact that we are reaching build out in the town of Northborough, those are going to continue to diminish. In other post-employment benefits, we've got to get back on schedule with that. So in terms of the financial trend component of the presentation tonight, the summary information that I would recap for you is that Northborough is in relatively good financial condition. Okay, the few unfavorable indicators we're watching and we are working around. Our financial reserves at the moment are healthy at about 9%. That's great news for us. Ironically, the fact that we cut the budget so hard in fiscal 2021 and constrained them in 2022, it means that as a ratio, our reserves have remained strong. When our budgets start to increase 3 or 4%, the money in the savings account and the stabilization account starts to, as a ratio, starts to decline. That's when we need to make contributions. Debt service, as I said, is manageable. Reliance on one-time revenues is back to the policy target. And we were able to make significant annual capital investments. We postponed those for 2 years. The wheels aren't falling off the vehicles yet, but clearly it is not a long-term strategy to save money by not investing in your buildings and your equipment and your infrastructure. That has to come back to us. So this is the good news. As we shift to the potential concerns, these are the things you hear me talking about constantly now. OPEB funding has to get back into the base budget. That is not easy to do. Basically, we got to fit $500,000 back into the tax base. That's going to have a tax impact. The postponed capital investments, we've got to get caught back up on that. We've created a bubble that will not go away, and in fact, will only increase in terms of cost over time. The stabilization fund, I mentioned, we have not contributed in 2 years, but our budgets haven't grown much in those 2 years, so it hasn't been a real issue for us. Beginning in fiscal 2023, I think we're going to see a little bit more of a natural, typical growth in budgets, which means we need to get back to, as part of that growth, contributing some of our one-time free cash back to stabilization fund. The good news is the free cash is at 3.4 million. We have it to contribute if we choose to. We still have a lot of uncertainty regarding local receipts and the economic recovery. What's happening? Every time you turn around, there's a new variant out there for COVID. We thought we were out of the pandemic vaccination clinics. We've been running clinics every Friday for the various age cohorts. We don't know how long that's going to go into the spring. We hope things are going to turn around, but really nobody knows for sure. So we have to continue to watch that. The last bullet here, I didn't spend a lot of time this year talking about this because last year we showed a whole lot of slides about new growth and available land for development. And we know that Northborough is reaching build out. And so our economic development, our new growth, and our growth in our tax base, that is not the residential taxpayer, that is going to diminish over the coming years. It's just a fact of that we are a maturing community. We're no longer a startup, that's growing rapidly. We are a maturing community that needs to be very careful about how they manage themselves to make sure that the slower revenue growth matches the slower budget and service growth. Because if we don't pair those up, we are going to find ourselves in an imbalance and needing overrides or burning through excess levy capacity faster than we would otherwise. So pull all this together, and what do we see? We shake the snow globe for fiscal 2023. We're looking at a Prop 2, not a Prop 2.5 increase. So a normal increase under 2.5, not an override. However, in order to get OPEB into the operating budget, we are phasing it in at $300,000. That's our proposal anyway, to phase it in for fiscal 2023. So in terms of the operating budgets are within the confines of a typical 2.5 increase. But we are going to need to dip into levy capacity if we want to get OPEB back into the base budget. And the idea is to phase it in over fiscal 23 and 24. And we do want to get to that $500,000 level. And we're probably looking at making a pitch to use some of the available Arpa funds to get us there at the appropriate time. But in terms of the tax increase, it's a Prop 2.5 increase. And the only thing above and beyond that is trying to get OPEB into the base budget. State aid, as I said, 1% increase over FY22. Local receipts are level funded. We're not using any one-time free cash, additional free cash in the operating budget beyond the $500,000, which are policy plans for. We want to get 500,000 back into OPEB. We have to get back on that. And that, as I said, would be a combination of taxes and probably ARPA funding. 200,000 stabilization fund. Again, we have not made any contributions to our reserves. As our budgets increase, in order to keep that level at around 8 or 9%, we're going to need to make a contribution to the stabilization fund. Why is that so important? It's important because we are just about to embark on our single largest, most expensive capital project, and that's a new fire station. That fire station, we go out to bid, we need the two things that the bond rating agencies really focus on are you funding your unfunded liabilities, your OPEB? Are you getting on a funding schedule for your pension? We are. And are your reserves strong? Because if there's a recession or a pandemic, the concept is that you have reserves to make that debt payment, even if the economy goes into the tank. And so they really want to see, ideally, they want to see the town of Northborough's reserves at 10%. I don't know if we'll get exactly at 10%. We don't want to lose any ground in this next budget cycle because our overall budgets are going up and that ratio will start to decline. So the magic number everybody's looking at is, so based on a 2.5 increase, what do we project the general government and the K-8 and the Algonquin school budget can increase? And based on a 2.5 increase, a Prop 2.5 increase, that number is 3.39%. If you look at that, you're like, okay, boy, that's oddly specific, 3.39%. Why not 3.4 or 3.5? It's literally a calculation of what's a Prop 2.5 increase, what do we think state aid's going to do, what are our local receipts going to do, and we back into that number. And we're trying always to get to about a 3.5% increase, because frankly, that's what the superintendent needs overall in the long run to maintain services. And that's what I need in the general government side of the budget to maintain services. The other point is that the budget assumptions are going to be that we are, of course, going to comply with our comprehensive financial policies. The biggest one being that we aren't going to use these one-time revenues that are coming to us from the federal government to expand the recurring service levels or to pump them into the budget to reduce tax impact, because A, you're not supposed to do that with those revenues, but B, all we're doing is creating a structural deficit. That's no different than taking money out of free cash and stabilization to support the budget. You're just creating a structural deficit that's going to roll forward. And it's going to roll forward at a time when we're going to be looking for the taxpayers to support an override for the next big building project. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. So those are the budget assumptions coming into fiscal 2023 as we see them. I'm going to just pause for a second through the chair. Does anybody have any questions about those assumptions? Because we're going to take your silence as agreement that these make sense. Okay. Look, the point of this exercise, the biggest value added of this exercise is to get consensus from all the policy boards and committees that we agree on the information, and we agree that there's going to be a process where these things will be discussed in more detail over the next several months. But if you think state aid is going to go up 10%, now's your time to speak. Okay. All right. So I'm going to now shift gears. So we've done the look back, we've done the trends and the indicators and the assumptions for the upcoming FY23 budget. And now the last portion of the presentation tonight is us shaking our snow globe and seeing what do we think we're going to see for our 5-year projections. These are subject to updating every single year. But the things we're going to cover here are the projections, the assumptions that we've used for those projections, the tax impact, and then ultimately what's our overall financial outlook, taking all of this information into consideration. Our revenue projections are a little bit different, or our financial projections are a little different than some other communities in that ours is a revenue-driven model because we have levy capacity. And what that means is we have not taxed to the maximum of Prop 2.5. So a community that is at their levy capacity means if they need or want to spend more, they have to go to the voters through the ballot to get a Prop 2.5 override, an operational override. We don't have to do that in Northborough because we have consistently taxed below the limits of Prop 2.5. So when we got significant economic development, we didn't just take those new revenues from that economic development and then raise everybody's taxes on top of that and expand and grow our budgets by 5, 6, 7%. What we did is we took those new revenues that came in from the new economic development, and we held and mitigated largely the impacts on the residential taxpayers. That's the value of our economic development. And it has resulted over the years in us having $4.3 million in excess levy capacity. Before anybody gets too excited about that, that is, again, it's an arbitrary number through an arbitrary calculation through an arbitrary legislation called Prop 2.5. The bottom line is that we have constrained our budget growth over the years through smart budgeting and good economic development. And that means that we have been able to reduce the tax increases over those years. Prop 2.5 places an artificial cap, and they have a formula, and that's where you come up with that excess levy capacity. So over the years that we're heading into now, where we talked about build out, reduced new growth, tight budgets between the state and local receipts, you're going to see increasing pressure building on the tax bill. If you take nothing else away from this entire presentation, that is where things are going to go. That's what happens in a mature community. So when you start topping out and you don't have much in the way of new growth, you get into a recurring budgets of sustaining your budgets. It's difficult if you want to expand and grow services and start new initiatives. It usually means you have to seek a Prop 2.5 override. Several of the surrounding communities directly abutting us have had to do that over the last several years. We have not. We have that levy capacity. And because of that, our models assume that in order for our budgets to go up and maintain services, that we will dip into that levy capacity as needed. So that's different. Many communities don't have that levy capacity there to model, and we do. So that's the main difference. Now, as we use fiscal 2022 as the base year, we're focused primarily on the three major categories: taxes, state aid, and motor vehicle excise. That's 95% of our revenues. And the goal, as I've said, is to maintain our current services, protect them, and to deal with marginal new service growth demands, right? So we're not going to be adding 20 new FTEs, but could you add one FTE in an area that you're trying to enhance services? Yeah, if you're disciplined about that, but you can't just wholesale start expanding services and staffing. It won't be sustainable. You'll burn through your levy capacity, taxes will go through the roof, and then you'll be facing an override before you know it. So the discipline, the policies, the discipline, and the conservative budgeting that's paid off up to this point will continue to pay off if we continue to work together. And that's the big thing about this meeting. I talk to a lot of my colleagues. The last thing they'd ever do is get the school committee in the same place with the finance committee, with the board of selectmen, because it would be like the WWF, it's no holds barred cage match, And I always say that's the difference in Northborough, is good information, good process, respect of the process and the information and of each other. And that's how we get to these sustainable budgets and everybody going to town meeting on the same page. So the assumptions in terms of these, the revenue projections is that again, we'll take a Prop 2.5, normal 2.5 increase. Our new growth is 40 million projected in FY 2023. And then we anticipate that it's going to drop down to 30 million. So we're not going to see a lot of new revenues from a lot of new development. And as I said, the existing unused levy capacity is available to dip into as we need to sustain our budgets. State aid throughout this, until somebody shows me something otherwise, we're estimating that that's, or assuming that that's going to go up about 1%, maybe 1.5%, maybe 2%, but it's not going to go up much more than that. We're not going to be like the Student Opportunity Act communities that are going to see their state aid going up 5, 6, 7, 8%. That's not us. Motor vehicle and local receipts are projected to slowly get back to where they were pre-pandemic. And then we're just holding them as level. As again, we're going to see the building permits and the new growth revenues start to taper off. Hopefully, as the economy improves, you all will go out and buy brand new spanking cars so that our motor vehicle excise revenue will come back. Really appreciate that if you could. So those are the assumptions. And the big thing is, you know, we don't have any gimmicks in here. We're not planning on using, you know, one-time revenues to bolster up the budget. We're not planning to draw down our reserves or to defer our capital investments. In order to be in good financial condition, you know this in your personal life, as you know, looking at this presentation. You have to maintain services, service level solvency has to be there. You have to pay off your debt and not get too far into debt. You need to make sure you're taking care of your long-term liabilities, all those things, and you need to make sure that you're maintaining your home and your vehicles. So these projections include all of those things. We also need to make sure that we're funding OPEB. These projections include the estimated debt for the fire station building project, so they're baked into the numbers. And then in terms of long-term projections on our budgets, as I said, we're looking at about 3.39% for fiscal 2023. And then we're carrying about a 3.5% increase for the high school K-8 general government. Now, these are forecasts, okay? We'll show you what those numbers look like. And there's significant budget impact, but there could be service impacts at the high school. In the past, shifting enrollments has been one of them, despite the fact that the high school budget has been very reasonable. Northborough's assessment has been disproportionately impacted because of shifting enrollments. Same thing happens to us at Assabet. You could get hit by a pandemic and have to spend more money on the Board of Health. So this is just for planning purposes. In order to sustain our operating budgets, roughly, we need about a 3.5% increase. So that's what we're modeling here. So let's see what this looks like. So this is the expenditure side, and it shows what that those increases from fiscal 23 to fiscal 27 look like. And here is the slide I'd like you to focus on. So these are the revenue projections based on the assumptions that I just covered. The yellow line in the middle is our excess levy capacity. And so, as I've said, we're assuming a Prop 2.5 increase that you can see there. That's you know, if the prior year's levy limit and then the 2.5% increase under the legislation, then your new growth. But we are anticipating, as we look at this out over 5 years, that we will dip into that new growth. Based on a 3.5% increase in the out years, we would still have levy capacity in year 5. And I know Tony Petit made the comment last year when we showed these numbers, because all the projections before always showed us running out of levy capacity and needing an override in year 5. And what's changed is fiscal 21 with the pandemic, we cut the budgets back to 1%. That simple act created significant levy capacity for us and sort of reset the clock. And the fact that fiscal 2022 were very conservative budgets at 3% or lower, roughly. That constrained spending has reset this clock. Now, as you all know, we've constrained our spending, just like in your own personal lives. You can cut back on things, but you just can't cut things to the bone and stay there. There will be service demands. There's requests for all-day kindergarten. There's requests for other services. There's requests to beautify the downtown. There's requests to do all types of things. So we are going to need more than the 1% or the 2%. Those were years that you make those constraints in a crisis. I'm sorry, in distress, so you don't get into crisis. But moving forward, if we want the town to look and feel like it does today, with a high quality education, safe streets, police, fire, health, all that, we're going to need more than, we're going to need about a 3.5% increase. So this is what it looks like. So the big question now is, as we model this, and these things are open every year to reinterpretation. And if we start to get more new revenues and things, you know, we modify, we update this every single year with what's happened, what's actually happened, and then forecast it forward. So these numbers move a little bit each year. So let's look at the tax impact. The big thing that is going to hit us in fiscal 2023 is not the superintendent's budget. It's not the general government budget. It's the fact that the residential housing market is so hot right now that values are increasing at least 10%. So if you look at the projections in the fiscal 2023 column, and I don't want anybody to start, you know, freaking out here, but based on a reasonable increase in those budgets, and all the other information and assumptions that I just laid out for you, it looks like we could be facing a $560 increase in the average single family tax bill. And the reason for that overwhelmingly is the increase in the single family home values. And just to split it out for you, you know, a 3.5% increase for most of the budgets translates roughly, very roughly, into about a $300 increase into the average single family home tax bill. So if you look at that, the balance of that for fiscal 2023 is the impact of the single family home values going up. We haven't seen values pop up like this in a very, very long time. Now, the thing to remember is during the recession, you know, going back to fiscal 10, 11, 12, back then, when single family home values were plummeting, that's one of the reasons why the tax impact was significantly lower. The single family home values were going down and our commercial industrial development was increasing. And that meant a lot of relief for the single family homes. I don't know that it's going to come out at that level. We hope we're going to get a little bit more state aid. Maybe our local receipts will rebound a little bit faster if we put the Omicron variant and the pandemic a little bit more in our rear view mirrors. Ultimately, you know, what is the budget that gets approved? That will all factor in. But as you look at this, there is, you know, over $225, $230 of that tax impact is just due to the fact that single family home values are going up. It's the market. Now, it's hard to tell people that, hey, listen, the good news is, look, if you had to pay capital gains tax because all your investments were going up 10%, you're not happy about paying the additional taxes, but you sure are happy that your asset appreciated by 10%. I hope people look at it that way. Your home is appreciating significantly. The problem is, as you all know, unless you're cashing out and retiring and moving to South Carolina, you're not going to realize that appreciation, but you sure are going to feel the tax impact. It is what it is. As we move forward and we look at the forecast, this chart here shows you where we've been, and I think we have managed ourselves very well. From 2011 to 2022, the average single family home tax bill has gone up $184, less than $200. That is very reasonable. For all the reasons I've been talking about for the last hour plus, that is unlikely to be the case moving forward, unless there's a recession and single family home values plummet and commercial industrial doesn't. All the pressure because of what's happening with state aid, the fact that we are reaching build out, all of these things factor into additional pressure on the single family home tax bill. So continued economic development, specifically industrial, commercial industrial development will help to mitigate some of that impact. Trying to keep budgets reasonable by not expanding. And the big thing for us is, adding staff. We're about 78% of our budgets are personnel related, salaries, benefits, somehow personnel related. So that's why we're always very cautious about just adding staff. We can do a little bit of staff here and there, but if you add staff, you're just going to accelerate this impact even faster. So that is the impact. That's what we're looking at. That is not unlike what many other communities are also looking at as they move forward. Everybody's seeing the rapid escalation in single family home values, which means they are going to see a rapid escalation in their single family home tax bills. But again, I think if you look back, we have been very, very responsible and conservative about managing that increase. Moving forward, we will continue to be. However, the pressure is going to be on us. We have a hand up, Julian, through the chair. You're on mute, Julian.
Hi, so what are you basing the increase in home values on? Is it just Northborough sales or regional or state, or how
No,
did
it's
you?
Northborough specific sales.
Specific-
And if you remember when we, on November 22nd, we set the tax rate, and we talked about the increase in family home values, and at that point, I believe it was about 5%. And we were trying to model that in our estimates, and we said if that increase is not, if you sold your house, that it's much greater than that, but there's a lag because we're using the data. When we increase our values, there's a year lag. And so when the market is going up, there's a lag, which means we're going to be feeling the hot market that everybody's been experiencing for the last 6 months. That's what's going to impact us next year. The converse happens. So when the market softens, there's a lag because it's based on the data from the prior fiscal year. So where we saw the market moving quickly, that's what's going to be coming and impacting us. But it's based on the actual data that the assessors track for sales of homes in Northborough.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so in terms of our financial outlook, I'm getting ready to wrap up here. We're looking at budgets increasing minimally to maintain services. No significant staffing or service level increases in these projections. The existing 4.3 million unused levy capacity is available to maintain services in this model. It's going to result in tax increases that'll range anywhere from 3.7 to 6.8% annually. Again, I have in here just reminding folks that the single family homes will be based on values in Northborough. Right now, single family value homes are going to go up at least 10%, forecast to go up at least 10% next year. And last but not least, these projections assume no major budget surprises. So if there is a double dip pandemic, if there is a major recession, all these assumptions should have to be revisited. The thing that I want people to take away from this is we have to get back to funding that OPEB. We have to get back as a priority our capital investments and deal with that bubble of projects that came forward, because we can't just keep kicking that can. We have to continue to actively manage and monitor our health insurance costs, which we are, as I said, we're out to bid right now. We may find ourselves going out to bid and changing carriers more frequently to try to manage that. There's not much else that we can do in regard to that. As far as COVID, we're watching the recovery and the economic impacts will continue to unfold. We'll know more. I'm very interested to hear in the state's revenue consensus hearing tomorrow what all the economists think is going to happen. And they usually provide some sensitivity analysis of, hey, if the pandemic continues to fade, this is what we think revenues are going to do. If the pandemic lingers on, we think it's going to, be lower. They like to give ranges. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what all the economists in the Department of Revenue think about the recovery and what it looks like for the next year or so. And then every year, as I said, we have to continue to get together and work collaboratively on making sure that we're balancing out the needs and the impacts to the taxpayer. No matter what, by virtue of all of this information, the impact and the pressure will be for the foreseeable future on the tax bills. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but you shouldn't be surprised by that based on the fact that we talk about these trends every year. And all of these trends have been going that way for the last 5 years, and we update them and we track them. There's no surprises here, guys. And that is the presentation. And I am happy through the chair, and now that we can see everybody again, to answer any questions that anybody may have. I know it's a lot of information. We'll get you the presentation. You can look at the slides. We'll post them up on the website. But I wanted you to kind of flow through it with me as we discuss the data. Silence. I take that as a vote of confidence that you agree with all the assumptions and the data as we see it. I say that with a little bit cheeky, but I am serious. The point of this exercise is to get some consensus about what do we see happening out there. And it's not bad news. In fact, we are in better shape than most because we have levy capacity and we are taking care of our capital and we're doing all the things that we need to do to keep our financial condition strong. We just need to stay the course. But it's one of the reasons why it's like in your personal life, if you want to buy a new car, you don't do it by stopping contributing to your retirement account, right, guys? You can't do that, or by deferring your maintenance. Although it's not sexy, you have to hit all of these bases. And that's why you measure all of these. That's why we report all of the indicators, but you have to hit all of these in order to be in good financial condition. And we're doing it. We will continue to do it. It means there's going to be constraints on that operating budget though, for sure.
John, I'd like to invite Superintendent Martineau if he has any comments or observations he'd like to share on the process.
No, I want to echo John's remarks around, it's early in the budget process. Key indicators and key information will be released in the next month or two. A lot of meetings behind the scenes in terms of getting better data to make more informed decisions. And I think for the regional budget, similar to Northborough's budget, we're waiting to finalize the healthcare increase or number. So that is an important factor. So, and then I'll just echo, it's a partnership. The school department works very closely with the town administration, understanding the larger context and making sure that, there's a collaboration and conversations that happen daily, if not more.
We talked all weekend. You're on mute, Jason.
I'm on mute, toggling here. There were a couple of questions I had. One, I think when you were speaking earlier, John, you were talking about the levy capacity and in conjunction with talking about the next big building project, which I took to be the fire department or the fire station project. I think you mentioned something to the effect of having to do an override for that project. I think what you meant was a debt exclusion.
Debt exclusion.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that clarification.
So,
and then with respect to the OPEB history that you showed us leading up to the current 10% ratio, there was also a line item in there, a discount rate, which started out earlier at 4% and now is up to 6.25%. Can you explain what the significance of that is or how it affects, what our position is with respect to the OPEB liability?
sure. Actually, I'll start and then I'm going to defer to Jason. But the discount rate is one of the assumptions that the actuaries make in determining what our unfunded liability is. And as you can imagine, there's a lot that goes into this. There are a lot of variables, and it's a very long 30-year horizon. So if you tweak one of those numbers by 1%, it can make a difference of $10 million in your liability. But that discount rate has gone up, and it's really, I'm probably stealing all of Jason's thunder. It's really GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, issues guidelines for what you should be using for that rate. And that changed. And so that is one of the things that dropped our liability, went from 44 million in 2018 to 34 million, and then it's creeped back up again. But that is a rate that is given to us through GASB, is used by the actuaries in their projections. And it has a lot to do with basically our return on investment, what we're getting credit for in terms of what we have in the trust fund. So that's gone a long way to help us out. Sorry, Jason, I don't know if I left you anything to say.
Well, you did a pretty good job of that, and I'm not going to do that great of a job either. So it's what the discount rate is. It's the long-term estimate of short-term cash flows. So basically, there's a very complicated calculation that goes into that's dictated by the GASB. And early on, there was multiple ways and methods that the actuaries use to calculate those discount rates. So you could find one actuary that would use one method to calculate it and give a lower liability, and then another actuary might use a more conservative approach, and it would be a lower discount rate, and you'd end up with a higher liability. So the most recent GASB kind of regulated that. So all of the actuaries seem to be using the same approach to calculating that discount rate. And this is part of it that's a little hard to explain, is that you get credit for the funding plan you've committed to. So under our funding plan, when our Worcester Regional retirement pension obligation is paid off, we'll have extra money available in our budget that's can be used to fund OPEB or something else. So we've indicated to the actuary that we will use this plan in 2037 because I'm going to be around to be sure that we commit all that extra money that we have after we pay off our pension obligation to put into OPEB. So basically the more funding we commit to funding to OPEB over time and add to it, we get credit for that in this calculation. So basically that's why that discount rate has been raised from what it initially was at the beginning when we weren't funding anything.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate
that. Now Jason has a degree in mathematics. Okay, you want your head to spin around, sit down with an actuary and ask them what they do and explain their assumptions. It's crazy. But the thing is, we try to the best we can understand what are the key assumptions, but and you get a handle on your liability and you start to formulate a plan, and then somebody who makes up the rules changes the assumptions. Same thing happened when you look at our pension liability. So our pension liability with Worcester, it's the amount of funding, or the funding ratio, had declined, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out, like, why is it going down when the economy and the investments were booming? And it was because as their returns were coming back really strong, then they decided, well, maybe our assumption of a 8% return is a little rosy, and it's more like 7%, and maybe people are living longer than our original assumptions. So they wound up having the actuary change the assumptions, and so even though the plan had this great investment return, the funding ratio didn't really move. So but now your assumptions were better and more realistic. So same thing when you meet with your financial planner. If you're counting on a 10% return for your retirement, probably want to dial that back a little bit. So I remember in the 80s, everybody's like, oh, 10%, we should be using 15%. So
another thing I'd just like to reemphasize maybe or revisit is just the discipline of financial policies with respect to reserves and OPEB and debt All of these factors kind of go into our bond rating, and the higher our bond rating is, the lower our borrowing costs for major projects. Such was the case for the Lincoln Street School and will be the case for the fire station project. So it's not simply trying to address those things in a very conservative or disciplined manner for their own sake entirely, but also because that contributes to savings for some of the other avenues we're pursuing in terms of capital investment, right?
Yes, and I think it's important as you, that you've pointed that out, because sometimes people can say, well, I would like, all-day kindergarten or more, staffing, or, fill in the blank for services. Why can't we just use the money that we're going to spend? That truck costs $250,000. Why can't we use that money for those services? And it's the same thing again as in your personal life, in that, you still have to take care of your house. You have to maintain your vehicle. You can't, and if you divert those funds, it's good for a year or two, but ultimately the expenses, those capital expenses, are going to grow. So, they should be viewed in the appropriate context. And again, we talked about this, the one-time revenues that we're getting from the feds, and particularly and potentially some from the state. The thing that you want to do with that is apply it towards those one-time capital costs. If you put in the operating budget, your budgets are going to grow and you're going to be up against the wall faster. If you use one-time revenues to pay for capital, you will actually have less expenses in your future operating budgets, because you're not paying financing costs, and those capital projects aren't increasing in costs because you've deferred them. So anytime you can take care of capital expenses on a pay-as-you-go basis, you will create budget capacity in the out years. And that's very important for people to understand. The capital budget and the operating budget are interrelated, but they're not interchangeable in terms of the amount that you're spending. It's very important for people to understand.
Leslie Rattan.
Yes, getting back to the bid process for health insurance, we're working with the schools and with the town of Southborough. It sounds like it's a very advantageous thing for us to do. Is that the kind of thing that changes every year based on the landscape in terms of who we want to work with collectively during this process?
Yeah, so we have probably for the last 5 years or so, maybe 6 years, Northborough has gone out to bid with the regional high school, and we both seen better rates because of it. We've always asked Southborough if they would like to participate, but Southborough has had different plan design changes, and they've been on different schedules, and it just hasn't matched up. I should mention, one of the benefits that will make the superintendent happier is that if Southborough can get on the same plan design as the regional high school in Northborough with the same carrier, well, guess what? He's responsible for 3 districts. Trying to explain 3 entities with 3 different contribution rates, 3 different plan designs, and 3 different carriers to a potential hire. It's like, well, I want to go work in Northborough instead of Southborough because they have a different plan design or a different expense. If we can standardize that as a byproduct, and we believe that we can, we think Southborough will see a better rate for their health insurance, a better plan design, and will have potentially continuity across the 3 districts. So that's you, and we will all see a better increase because we have leverage. We are a credible. The way they say it is you're a credible entity. In other words, you have enough people and enough budget clout that they have to actually negotiate with you a little bit, as opposed to just saying market's going up 8%, you're getting an 8% increase. Because it doesn't matter if your loss ratios were really good one year and they're really bad the next year. You only have a handful of people. It's not credible. But if you have 500 subscribers, now you're credible. Now you've got a little bit of clout at the table. And that is why I think we're going to see a reasonable increase, or reasonable increase with this new bid. Again, we're hoping within a couple of weeks to roll this out, one of the things that we need to do is we need to meet with all of our employee unions and through our insurance advisory committees and explain to them what we're doing. Now, unlike years past, we don't have to negotiate these changes because we're not making the change. The carrier dropped us, so we're out to bid, and we're not making changes to the plan design or the contribution rate. So we don't have to negotiate this, but we have partnered with all of our employees. I showed you that chart, 10 years, 3%. That's because every time health insurance went wild, all of the unions came together in good faith at the table, and we figured out how to make it work. That has been going on for over a decade. So there's a high level of trust. And in this particular case, we need to move fast because we're going to get dropped by Fallon. We have to have a carrier. So it'll be a different card, same plan, same good plan design, same contribution rate, and the budget increase hopefully will be minimal for them and for the town. So this stuff though, it takes, I can't tell you how much time we have spent on this behind the scenes. This is the biggest budget issue, and we were thrown into this without honestly, if I could have just stayed with Fallon at a reasonable budget increase, we wouldn't have spent much time on this until we had to, but we have to. So I know I've done a lot of talking, and your indulgence is greatly appreciated, but before I forget, I want to acknowledge the financial team that put all this information together. I'm the spokesperson, but Jason Little has done yeoman-like work to get this together for you tonight. He was here all weekend working on it, as well as Lisa Trost, our treasurer collector, who was here all day on Sunday, and Becca Meekins, the assistant town administrator. It's a team effort to get this. There's a lot of information to compile in a short amount of time. And we were really crunched because we didn't close out fiscal 21 until a couple months later than we normally would. So that everything got compressed. So we appreciate your patience. But I can't say enough about this team. And as always, on the school side, I can't ask for a better partner than Superintendent Martineau. I talk to him almost daily. I always know what he's doing. He always knows what I'm doing. And we talk things out to make sure that if there's a problem, we get out ahead of it. So when we come to you, we have talked these things through and we have a solution and not just bringing you problems. So again, that's the grease that makes this stuff work in Northborough. So I thank them greatly.
I'd like to just add my thanks. I know, well, I won't call it firsthand, I'll call it secondhand. The many hours that a lot of town staff have been putting into this, on top of the other demands that have been on their plate with the closeout of fiscal year and a lot of the tracking of expenses and everything for the various grants and assistance that have been going on. It's been very, very demanding schedule. And, the fact that, you're in through the weekend, the week before, Christmas here, for many of us, that really speaks a lot to the dedication and trying to get all of this information in order for us on the boards and committees to try to see it, digest it, and understand it well enough to move forward through the budget process at this point. So thank you all very much. It's a lot of work, and I think it speaks to the professionalism of everyone involved in the fact that these policies and methodologies have been in place for a decade. Have served us very well, served us extremely well through the COVID pandemic, and continues to do so. And I'm just very fortunate, feeling very fortunate that we have this expertise at our disposal here to help our town get through this circumstance. Certainly many other towns are facing much greater struggles in trying to make it through. And I think it has a lot to do with the people we have in place here who understand this and know, as I say sometimes, how to solve problems, not just recognize problems, but how to find solutions to problems. And each and every year put together this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle we call the municipal and school budgets to get us to a point where we can go to town meeting and provide a kind of a consistent and cohesive presentation to to the citizens for them to approve. So saying that, any other questions or comments from any member, board, or committee? Please raise your hand if you have anything. Seeing none, John, any parting comments?
No, just I want to thank all the boards and committees for your time and attention. The next phase of this budget process is, of course, start delving back into the Financial Planning Committee will begin meeting, looking at the capital. Appropriations will begin meeting, starting to look at departmental budgets, and that will consume the next month or so of our time. So this stuff will begin to unfold with a little bit more meat, and we'll be reporting back as we make progress on those things. And if anybody has any questions, I'll send out the full presentation. And if you look at it and you have any questions, you want to talk about anything that's contained in it, I'm happy to do so. So again, if anybody just occurs to you, or if there's something you didn't feel comfortable asking, I'm happy to speak offline to anybody. It's great information. It's important that people understand the information because it's the basis upon which we move forward. So it's important to me that the board and committee and the policy boards and committees have a good comfort level with this information. So thank you all. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, John. As I mentioned at the start, and I'll repeat it here, because this is an informational presentation and no deliberations taking place here, we have the several boards and committees present, but we can, if there's no objection, deem this to have been a Board of Selectmen meeting with all of you as guests. We'll produce a set of minutes for this meeting and approve those through the Board of Selectmen, circulate them to all of you, for your information. I don't think there's any need for each of you to have to undertake that for each individual committee if you'd prefer not to. Does that sound fine to everybody? No objections? Okay, very good. Since this is deemed to be a Board of Selectmen meeting, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chair, I move we adjourn.
Second,
Moved by Scott Rogers, seconded by Leslie Rattan. This is a roll call vote. Kristen Wickstead,
Aye.
Julianne Hirsch,
Aye.
Scott Rogers,
Aye.
Leslie Rattan,
aye.
and I, Jason Perot, vote aye. Carries unanimously. We are adjourned. Thank you all this evening, and have a great night.
Thanks very
Happy
much.
holidays.
Take care.